All right, so this is the end of our series, Living in His Presence. And we've been talking about worship, and this weekend is His Christmas. This is the 9th message I've preached in this series, and we're talking about mainly worship is how we live in His presence, a lifestyle of worship. And I talked about Thanksgiving a few weeks ago, so I want to talk about Christmas. So if you'll turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2, we're going to focus on the Christmas story out of Matthew, not out of Luke, for our purposes today. Matthew chapter 2. If you think about this, when His presence came into the world, people began to worship Him. People began to show up to worship Him because they wanted to be in His presence. And we're going to focus mainly on the wise men today, all right? So Matthew 2, look at verse 1. And I'm going to highlight a few things in here. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, sorry, I should have emphasized one thing. After Jesus was born, not before He was born, but after He was born, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east, probably Persia, and we'll talk about that, came to Jerusalem. I just want you to notice the wise men did not come to Bethlehem at first. They did go to Bethlehem, but not at first. At first, they came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is He?" So they didn't know where He was. "Where is He who has been born King of the Jews? For we've seen His star," and we're going to talk about that star, "in the east, and we have come to worship Him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he gathered all the chief priests, in other words, the pastors and the ones that knew the scriptures and the scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet." So they got the scriptures out. And they read Micah 5:2, by the way. "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, this is because Herod wanted to kill Jesus, we know, but he also wanted to kill the witnesses, in my opinion. That's why he secretly called them the wise men and told them to come back. He determined from them what time the star appeared. Again, you have to remember, this was not at the birth of Christ that the wise men came. They came after the birth, and I'll show you this, all right? He determined what time the star appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child." Notice not the baby, but the young child. "And when you found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." Of course, he didn't want to worship him. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they'd seen in the east went before them. This is a supernatural phenomenon. Till it came and stood over where the young child was. I keep emphasizing young child, just to let you know, young child is in, from verse 8 to verse 21, it's 9 times in 14 verses, young child. "When they saw the star," verse 10, "they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they'd come into the house, not the stable, they saw the young child," not the baby, "with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshiped Him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to Him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way." Okay, so we know that these guys came to worship Jesus. I want to show you 3 things about their worship that we can learn from, all right? Here's number 1. It was expectant worship. It was expectant worship. In other words, they came expecting something to happen when they entered the presence of the king. They came expecting something. They came about 1,000 miles. Now, I'm going to tell you some things about the wise men. You've heard them. They're called the Magi. That's because that's the Greek word. Magi meaning the plural of magos, which is one. But here's what it means. Now, I don't want to burst your bubble on some things, but you have to understand they were from the east. They weren't Jewish people. It's Magi is where we get our word magic. They were magicians. They were astronomers and astrologers. They were sorcerers, probably, was the whole magi, the group of magi. Now, these particular men were probably believers, and I'm going to show you why I believe that. But let me show you a few scriptures about the magi. Daniel 2:2, then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the magi, the magicians, the astrologers, that's not astronomy, that's astrologers, and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. So these men came from a group called the Magi, which were magicians. Now, don't be too hard on them, because you have to think about that we were born with a hunger to know the supernatural. And so if you weren't a part of Israel and you didn't know about God, and you're not, or even today, a believer, people have a hunger to know the supernatural. That's why in some cultures they have witch doctors, and there's sorcery still to this day, and fortune telling, and horoscopes, because people have this desire. I believe these men had this desire. Now, I'll tell you again some things about them, and that's why also there were magicians in Egypt. Remember when Moses went, there were magicians. But let me tell you something about them that you might not know. Many theologians believe that Balaam, and many historians believe this, that Balaam, that the king of Moab hired to curse Israel when they were coming through the wilderness. If you remember, he hired Balaam because Balaam was a sorcerer, a magician. He was someone who cast spells on people, spoke curses over people. Many historians believe, and many theologians believe this, that he's the father of the Magi. And when he came to cast the spell on a curse on Israel, God wouldn't let him. And this is something that people don't know, but Balaam was actually the first one to prophesy about the star. This is possibly where these Persian magi learned about the star. I'll show you the scripture. Numbers 24:17. Balaam was prophesying. He said, I see him. I see him, capital H, him, but not now. I behold him. So he's prophesied under God's Spirit, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. So these Persians go back to Balaam, their first one, because Moab, remember, was conquered by Persia. So when they study their history, they go back to Balaam, to one of their prophets and probably the founder of their organization, and they find him that he can't curse Israel because of their God, and he actually blesses them, and he prophesies about a star. You got to remember, in the days of Esther, that was Persia that had taken over, and they were going to kill Israel, and God rescued, through Mordecai and through Esther, God rescued the Jewish people. So when the Persians are studying their history, they realize once again the God of Israel rescued his people. Are you following me? You got to remember in Daniel, when they were in the Babylonian captivity, that was Persia. They were Persians. Those Persians then, they're magicians, they're magi, they're astrologers. I just read you out Daniel 2:2, could not interpret the dream. But a Jewish man could. And a Jewish man was rescued from the lion's den. And 3 other Jewish men were rescued from a fiery furnace. Are y'all following me? So these Persians, reading their history, keep reading about the God of the Jews rescuing his people. And they go back to a prophecy that a star is going to show when this Messiah comes. And then Daniel prophesies, the Bible is so phenomenal, Daniel prophesies that the Messiah is going to come in 483 years. He prophesies that, 483 years. 483 years later, you say, well, is that when Jesus came? No, he was actually born 453 years earlier. You say, well, where's the discrepancy? Because he began his ministry when he was how old? 30. 483 years. Exactly. And they knew that the Jewish people began their ministry when they were 30 years old. You can look at Joseph when he was 30 years old, David when he was 30 years old. Most people believe Daniel was 30 years old when he interpreted the dream. We don't know from the Bible that, though, but Jewish history tells us that. Okay, so 30 years old. So they go back 30 years, and the planets lined up at that time, and they see the star. And then they travel. They weren't on camels. Sorry. You can still leave the camel in your nativity scene, that's okay. They weren't on camels, they were on Persian horses, the finest horses in the world. It took them about 9 months. They traveled about 1,000 miles, these Persian horses. But they weren't at the stable. And we don't know how long it took them to gather their things before they left. So Jesus was either somewhere between 9 to 18 months, because when Herod determined the time, he killed all of the young men 2 years and under. See what I'm saying? So he was a toddler, wasn't a baby when the wise men came. Again, sorry to blow your nice nativity scene, but the wise men weren't there at the stable. It says very clearly when they come into the house, when they came into the house, they saw the young child, not the baby, okay? And I'm all for nativity scenes. I love nativity scenes. My personal belief is we should put a nativity scene on all government property. That's my personal belief. So, just you all know. Okay. But here's my point. It had been passed down for hundreds of years about this Messiah. And these Persian men traveled 1,000 miles to get in his presence and to worship him. I have one very simple question under point 1. If they made that much effort to get in his presence, why don't you make just a little effort? They knew, they were expectant. You should have an excitement start coming up in your hearts on Thursday and Friday that you're going to get to enter God's presence with his people. Now, you can enter his presence every day, and I want you to, but there's something different about entering his presence with his people. Would you agree? I talked with a guy this week, and he was a great guy, great family, comes to our church, been coming about 4 years. But he was open and honest with me about worship. He said, I didn't grow up in a church like this. You know, the expressive worship and hands and all the stuff, you know. And so he said, when we first started coming, my wife and I, we would come to the 10:45 service, but I told her it started at 11. Because he said the worship made me uncomfortable. I said, really? He said, yeah, but we get there early now. Because now he's learned that worship, listen, please understand, I know you like the message, but the message is just the icing on the cake. The cake is the presence of God. The cake is worship and his presence.